Hello, fellow history bounders, historical customers, and Jodhpur enthusiasts. If you've been here before, welcome back, and please enjoy the temporary change of scenery. If you're new to this channel, welcome one and all. Pull yourselves a chair and get comfortable. Summertime for me is largely spent passing the hot, humid days along and often in the shores of the nearest river, stream, or lake. But as someone who doesn't really love wearing shorts, this inevitably presents a bit of a dilemma and often leads to wet pants. So, a pair of historically inspired capris seemed just the garment for the season. As some of you may remember, last fall I made myself a pair of wool bloomers based off the free Bikes and Bloomers pattern that I've linked down in the description. And now that we're fast approaching the swampy months of summer, I've decided to make a second pair in a lighter fabric. And because one of my top comments I get on this pattern is regarding the sizing, the original pattern only comes in one size, I've decided to team up with Camille of ofMother Hem Creations. She has very successfully scaled this pattern up in the past, and she will be making a video on her process for those of you who would like to use this pattern but are nervous or unsure how to go about making it larger. I will link her video below, and you should definitely go check it out. So rather than simply reuse this pattern as it stands, and because I am apparently incapable of making things easy for myself, I decided to model them after this delicious pair of steampunk-esque jodhpurs that has been haunting my Pinterest page. My Pinterest link kept bringing me to the knockoff pair on Wish, but a more dedicated search revealed that they were originally made by Kato of Steampunk Couture somewhere around 2014. This specific style does not seem to be in production anymore, but I will put a link to their website in the description in case you want to go and check out some of the other gorgeous garments that they have made. And since I already made a video about the making of this original pair of bloomers, this video will focus mainly on the elements of construction that differ from that original pair. Now, I have officially no idea how to modify my bloomers pattern to look like this, so I decided to tackle one change at a time and to start small. Literally. I drew up a miniature version of the bloomers in order to work on a more manageable scale and to avoid wasting too much paper and fabric on various drafts. I will be mainly focusing on the front pattern piece, as this is where the majority of the changes will be made. Following the inspiration photo, the first step was to make a separate waistband, so I simply chopped off part of the original pattern to remain untouched. Then I had to tackle the extra volume that would be added in the tuck feature we see on the hip and then towards the lower thigh. A quick note of historical background on this style of pants. The jodhpur originated from an ancient style of Indian trousers called the churidar, which extends from the waist to the ankle and is tight along the calf but baggy at the hips. Sir Pratap Singh, the youngest son of the Maharaja of Jodhpur, was an avid polo player and dissatisfied with the prevailing style of riding breeches. So, in the late 1800s, he embarked on a quest to produce a garment more suited to the needs of the game. He kept the tight fit of the churidar from the calf to the ankle, but he increased the baggy aspect by flaring the garment along the thighs and the hips, which allowed for a greater range of movement while riding, a revolutionary design in the era before the invention of stretch fabrics. He also reinforced the fabric along the inner calf and knee to protect them from rubbing while riding. In 1897, Singh traveled to England to visit Queen Victoria for her Diamond Jubilee, an event we'll hear more about in my next video. He brought his entire polo team with him, whose riding clothes caused quite a sensation among the fashionable circles. It didn't hurt that they won quite a few matches as well. The Indian Jodhpur style of flared thigh and hip was rapidly adopted by the British polo-playing community, who further modified it to the existing designs of English riding breeches, which ended snugly at mid-calf and were worn with tall riding boots. This style, which continues to this day to colloquially be called jodhpurs, are more accurately termed flared hip breeches. The style was then taken up by women in the 1920s as they shifted away from riding horses side saddle and started riding astride. One of the first high-profile women to adopt wearing the jodhpurs was Coco Chanel, who was a fierce fan of horse riding and who eventually designed her own breeches based on the outfits of male riders. To help set me in the right direction as I started to make my own pair of flared hip breeches, I turned to some historical sources for similar styles and found inspiration both in this photo, which demonstrated how to add volume at the side of the thigh, as well as these men's riding breeches in a tailoring book from 1885. With the help of these images, I first added the bulk along the hip, guessing at the shape and figuring I could fine-tune it on my first full-sized mock-up. Unfortunately, I didn't find any historical sources for the next feature, that cute hip tuck detail that we see in the original inspiration, and which I definitely wanted to keep in, so it was up to plain guesswork and trial and error. I started by drawing a line about where I thought the tuck should fall and used the slash and spread technique to add some more volume along the waistline. I could have spread the pieces so the extra volume ran in a parallel strip, like so, but that would have added more volume at the calf as well, and this pattern already has a lot of fabric being gathered down into the cuff, so I thought that limiting the extra volume to the waist might be more effective for the look I was going for. The next step was to tackle this curved flap, and to be honest, I had no idea how I was going to handle it. I just took my best guess, drew something out, and decided that this pattern was good enough to take the idea off the paper and into the fabric. Besides being super cute, the miniature version seemed to be a sufficient proof of concept, so I moved on to the full-size pattern, following the same steps as before, but on a larger scale and with more precision.
Also, did I really have to put cuffs on these bloomers? No, not really. But also, yeah, kinda.
First, I added roughly 5 centimeters to the bottom of the bloomers because I found that the knees of my old pair pinch a bit when I ride my bike. Then, before I chopped up the pattern too much, I traced out the top portion in order to draft the crossover waist flap. A line was drawn to mark out where the waistband would be cut off, and then I drew out the waist flap. For those of you who left their French curves in another continent, I can highly recommend a variety of household items to solve all your drafting dilemmas. A quick check to make sure that I wasn't obscuring the pocket in case I decided to add that in, and I could move on to the next step, cutting off the waistband, then slashing and spreading for the waist tuck feature. Next up was adding the balloon effect to the leg, and to be sure I got the right shape, I kept my main inspiration photo close at hand and tried to imitate the shape of the curve as closely as possible. So a bit more tweaking to the pattern and it looked good enough to make a mock-up. This was admittedly a rather sloppy mock-up, but as I'd already made the base pattern once, I was less checking the fit and more checking to see how my modifications looked. I learned a few things, namely that it looks better if I top stitch the tucks so that they hold their shape, and also that I'd probably want a modesty flap under the main crossover flap. I also thought that they looked a bit too baggy in general, so I shaved off even a bit more of the bulk around the knees. The finalized pattern looked like this: 2 back pieces, 2 back facing pieces, 2 front pieces, one with the crossover flap and one with a rectangular chunk added on as a modesty panel, 1 front facing for the crossover flap that looked a bit like a strange diaper, 3 waistbands, 2 cuffs, and later 1 pocket. With my pattern pieces finalized, I could move on to tracing them all out, which I mostly did with a pen as the ink would remain hidden in the seam allowances. But for some elements, such as the back darts that sat within the seam allowances, I thread marked them before cutting everything out. While I finish cutting this out, let's go check in with Camille. Camille, how's it going?
We are doing good. We have 3 pairs of these trousers cut out and are about to get started on sewing them. So the original mock-up video is done, and part 2 hopefully will be out fairly soon, so stay tuned for that.
Returning to this project, now that the pieces were all cut out, I could move on to the assembly. First, the back darts and the front hip tucks were added. Once the tucks were in and sewn down, the front waistband could be added. Then, the front diaper facing, which is now interfaced, was pinned down using an excessive number of pins to make the shifty linen less shifty. This was sewn together. Then, in a totally unnecessary step that I really find satisfying, I actually removed the interfacing from the seam allowance in an attempt to eliminate some bulk and make a cleaner, thinner waistband. This was then turned right sides out, ironed, and top stitched down. Then the diaper facing, which I had intentionally left large, was marked and trimmed down. The interfacing again removed from the seam allowances, and the raw edges were ironed under to be hidden when the facing was sewn to the front waistband. With the tucks in and the waistbands sewn on, the fronts could be joined together along the crotch seam. The backs could also be sewn together, again along the J-shaped crotch seam. The back facing was added, although there was a moment of confusion while I tried to figure out why it looked so strange, and then I realized. The facing pattern was from the old pattern, but I had chopped off these little side nubbins from the main piece and forgotten to chop them off the facing. This little mistake was fixed, and then the back facing sewn on, turned right side out, and ironed down. Take care not to sew down the vertical seams like I did, instead leave them open and only sew along the top horizontal line. Next, the side seams were pinned, leaving a section along the waistband open in case I decided to add a pocket or two. Now, I should clarify here that I am firmly team pockets, but I wasn't sure if adding a pocket, which was not in the original design, would mess up the look of the fitted waist or interfere with those cute hip tucks in front. I did end up adding a pocket. It doesn't gape or mess with the look of the pants, and if I was to do this again, the only thing I'd change was that I'd add 2 pockets. With the legs all sewn up, I could move on to the cuffs, which were first ironed in half, then measured against my actual calf to see how tight I needed them. The pant legs were given 2 rows of basting stitches, then gathered down to match the length of the pre-measured cuffs. Once sewn down on the inside, the cuffs were flipped around and pinned down to the outside, hiding all the raw edges and ensuring that the final line of stitching holding it down could be made from the outside of the pants, allowing for a cleaner stitch line. Then it was down to the last small details. The bottom of the front flap was given a solid bar tack with my widest zigzag setting to help prevent stress on the stitches as the flap was opened and closed. Buttons were chosen and buttonholes were stitched, using various widths of zigzag stitch because I still haven't bothered to learn how to use the actual buttonhole setting on my machine. Here is where I made a bit of a mistake because in the inspiration photo, the buttons line up perfectly with those hip tucks, which is not only super visually pleasing, but it also helps hide any small errors you might have made on those tucks. I accidentally sewed the buttonholes before remembering to check their placement in relation to those tucks, so my buttons ended up being a bit too wide. If I make a second pair, I will definitely be fixing this mistake. With the buttonhole sewn in, I could mark the placement of the buttons, which I prefer to do while wearing the pants. The buttons were sewn on, both at the waistline as well as on the cuffs. I decided to try adding a pocket, so I pulled out a skirt I made last year and copied the pocket bag from that, because this pocket is the perfect size to hold anything I might need to carry on my outings. One side of the pocket was interfaced, to keep the flimsy linen from stretching out too much, while not adding unnecessary amounts of bulk. Again, shifty linen was kept in check with mini pins, then the bag was sewn together with a zigzag stitch to keep fraying to a minimum. The pocket was pinned in place along the side seam, just under the waistline, and then sewn on, being careful not to catch the opposite side of the bag in my seam. The plan was to add in some small hidden snaps along the inside waistband and that modesty flap to keep things from shifting around as I move, but I couldn't actually find any in my house, so those will be added in later. And honestly, I was outside for a few hours yesterday filming the reveal and tramping all through the woods and along the beach, and I actually didn't have any problems, so this step may be optional. The side seams were then given a double line of top stitching to help that seam stay nice and flat and open, to prevent fraying, and to add some structure, helping the baggy side seams keep their shape in what is otherwise rather flimsy and airy linen. Alright, so before we roll the reveal shots and see how these pants look, giving them a spin out in the wild, let's reconvene for a moment to talk about this pattern. Even though, as I've already mentioned, there are a couple things I'd modify for a second version, I am super pleased with this pair and I think they turned out quite cute. I really love the hip darts, and the baggy flowy linen is just so comfortable and mobile. I know that there are a lot of similar style breeches or jodhpurs out there that have that second darker color on the inside of the thighs, but I just couldn't find a fabric that would work well with the tan linen, so I simply left it out. And it kind of works well because I wanted to keep these as light and flowy as possible. And actually, speaking of tan, I'm generally not a fan of using this color in clothing because I find that for me personally, at a glance, it tends to make me look like I'm walking around pantsless, which is, you know, still illegal in most of the countries I frequent, so I try to avoid that. But because these are so poofy and flowy, it's at least a bit more apparent that I'm wearing something, so I'm still not a huge fan of the color, and I think I'm going to have to be careful how I style it to keep the aesthetic more cute 40s land girl and less colonizer bounding. Fortunately though, I've got some ideas for that for future videos. If you enjoyed watching my process, give the video a thumbs up. Let me know what part you found most useful or insightful, and definitely tell me if you think you'll be making a pair as well. If you have questions on a certain part, definitely leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to clarify and help out. And definitely be sure to go check out Camille's video if you would like some ideas on how to upsize this pattern. If you are able and want to financially support the channel and help me continue to do my thing, I have a Ko-fi page, which I've linked in the description below, which is basically a virtual tip jar where you can leave any amount of money. I'm currently trying to raise funds to upgrade my light setup to anything less fickle than the sun. And now, let's take a look at the final product.